Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing whether or not my Viper was secretly crashed by the previous owner. And to put it one way, I wouldn't be making this video if I thought that it wasn't crashed, so let's get into it. There's a few reasons I think this car was crashed, and I think if you took any of these reasons independently, you'd probably be like, I don't think so, or, maybe, but extremely unlikely. But when you start taking all of these data points and putting them together, it just builds a stronger and stronger case for why I think it was in an accident at some point. So what are these data points? Well, the first is that when I was doing the brakes on the car when I first got it, I typically do this with all my cars, but I was cleaning up a lot of the grease that was on the control arms just because I like it to look a little bit nicer and because I've got a lot of pride of ownership, especially on this vehicle. But when I was specifically on the front driver's side and I wiped off the lower control arm, I noticed something a little bit unusual, and that was that the control arm had part numbers written on the side almost with like a grease pen or chalk. If you're relatively new to working on vehicles or you don't really know what that means, that is not a common thing. Original manufacturers do not do that from the factory. Usually if you see a part number written on it, especially with that classic white like grease pen type of look, typically that means it is a used part, and they wrote down the part number when they were putting it into inventory on their shelves. A lot of scrapyards do this, a lot of warehouses, a lot of eBay vendors do this. It helps them keep track of the part from an inventory standpoint, but also if you physically pick up the part and you want to look up whether or not it's in your system, you immediately know what the part is. But to me, it was a little weird that only the lower control arms were replaced on only the one side. That said, there's nothing else I found that looked extremely damaged in that wheel well. The brake rotor was a little bit chewed up, but that's not immediately a red flag. The coilover suspension might have been replaced at some point, again, not immediately a red flag, but the A-arm being replaced and only on one side and not on both sides, that is a little bit of a red flag. Those aren't a part that routinely wears out. Like your suspension actually wears out, the A-arm itself does not. That's a solid piece of metal, so the only case that you really replace it is if the old one is damaged, which on its own doesn't necessarily mean that the car was crashed. But the other thing that I think was replaced was the front wheel. The reason being, when I repainted these wheels, I stripped down the clear coat prior to repainting them. The finish on one of those front wheels, that like epoxy clear coat that went over the top of it, that was a lot more thin on one of the front wheels, but only on one of those front wheels relative to all the three other wheels. So I suspect that wheel was replaced and it did come off of that corner. Most likely it was either refinished or replaced with like a used OEM one, but even if it was another OEM one, if it had a different manufacture date, the coating thickness could have been just a little bit different, or if they did the refinishing on the same one, the same thing would happen where the finish would be just a little bit different. I just can't think of any other explanation for why the thickness of the clear coat would be any different on only one wheel, and it's the one corner that also happens to have a new control arm. Going along with that is the alignment was completely out of spec when I got the car. And it's not so much that the car didn't track straight, it's that when the car was tracking straight, the wheel was actually turned something like 10 to 20 degrees to the left, which again tells me it probably got hit on that front left corner. It pulled the wheel that way, they repaired everything, and then forgot to check whether or not the actual steering wheel was straight when they did those repairs. So now it's not just that one of the suspension components is replaced, we have a wheel that has completely different finish, and we have the alignment being completely out of whack by that much. These together are no longer a coincidence. These are pointing to some major suspension repairs and no longer just like a slight misalignment that you might get from routine use of the car. But the part that puzzled me is that I could not personally see any body damage. To me, all the panel gaps were pretty even. They were all within factory spec, and at least to my eyes, the panels matched each other from a color perspective. However, I'm not a bodywork professional, and the person who is a bodywork professional who looked at this actually asked me before I picked up on all this damage what happened to that front corner of the car. So the detailer that I took the car to for the paint correction, who does this kind of thing all day long, when I was picking up the car, he said, "What happened to that front left? Who repainted it? When did that occur?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. I was actually a little bit surprised. So I asked him what he was talking about, and he's like, the color is just a few shades off. It's almost like a hint more brown there. And he was trying to point it out to me in the parking lot, and the lighting at that time of the day isn't as good as the lighting was in his shop, so it was probably easier for him to pick it up when he was looking at it under his lights. But after that, if you see it in the perfect sunlight at just the right angle, you can see it's just the slightest bit different shade of black. It's not even necessarily that the shade is off, it's almost like the depth of the paint is different, and it's only on that front left side, that driver's side. It doesn't occur on the other side of the car. Now, to be honest, I probably would never have noticed had the detailer not pointed that out to me. The difference really is that subtle. I don't think I would have picked it up on my own, but now that I know that it is different, I know where to look and what I'm looking for, it sticks out to me just enough that it kind of bothers me a little bit. When I was initially talking to the detailer, we were thinking maybe it was just a difference of the composite material of the hood versus the fender, but the fenders on these are also composites, so they are not really a different material. They shouldn't soak in the paint any differently. That alone should not explain the color difference, especially when the other side still matches. The other part that I could not pick up when I was initially driving the car, and especially when I first got it and I couldn't really push the car because I didn't know its limits, is that only under heavy loading that front left acts a little bit squirrely. One of the only times I've caught this on camera was actually one of the first times I took the car to work. I had a high-speed sweeper that was going to the right, so it was loading up that left suspension, and when I lifted off of the gas and it put a little more weight on that front corner, I got a little bit of snap oversteer because the car was unsettled in that front corner and it was just gripping a little bit weird. Now, as I've gotten a little more acclimated to the car and I know how it performs under different conditions and under different temperatures, I've actually noticed that that was not a one-off, that was not a fluke of those circumstances. It's any time that front left is loaded up, something is a little bit off that makes the car a little bit squirrely when you lift off or you go into the brakes. It doesn't happen with the right side, and I know that obviously there's a little bit of a difference with me being on the left side of the car from a weight distribution standpoint, but that difference in the weight distribution of left to right isn't enough of a difference for how different the feel is on the left and the right side when you make those transitions. So I think the fact that it handles differently when you load up that side, the fact that it looks like some of those parts were replaced, and the fact that the wheel is so far off center, these all paint the picture that something happened in that front corner, but it was repaired and covered up. The thing that really solidifies it for me is when I had the conversations with the previous owner when I was buying the car. I had already checked the Carfax was clean, but I was worried about this exact thing occurring because I've heard horror stories of something like this happening to somebody else, and quite frankly, as I've said, I'm not somebody who does body work. I've got a general gist of what could go wrong, but I can't see it as good and as easily as somebody who does this for a full-time job. So knowing that, I explicitly asked the owner if the car had been in the accident, regardless of what the Carfax had said, specifically so I wouldn't get in this situation where I found out the car might have had some underlying damage that was repaired that I should know about prior to driving it aggressively and potentially putting my own life at risk. And I didn't pick up on this at the time, but he had a slight pause before he answered, and the way he answered was a very calculated and roundabout answer. He did not say, no, the car has not been in an accident. He didn't even say no. Instead, he said, and I quote, "There is no accident on the history," which I found to be a little bit weird, but everything else on the car to me was looking pretty good and the deal was too good to pass up. So at least in my mind, all the evidence points to it being crashed probably by him in that front left corner. Then he didn't go through insurance, so wouldn't be on the history, and then resold it knowing that it was crashed by him at some point. He probably paid cash for the repairs because if it was only a couple suspension parts, the wheel, and maybe the fender, chances are the repair cost would not have been worth going through insurance, especially given how much his premiums would have gone up. He probably would have paid under $5,000 for the full repairs. I also think that the previous owner had the resources to repair it in cash. As I've said in other videos, he was a business owner. It seemed like he was in a fairly comfortable financial state. He owned this car for 12 years. I think he had the resources available to repair it if he did have an accident with it. The other thing he said that made me skeptical is when I was talking to him about the wheel being off-centered, I didn't even ask if he knew why that was. I just kind of assumed that maybe it was over time, the wheel slowly got more and more off-center. He immediately offered up, "Oh, I've never thought about why that is." But his tonality wasn't, "Oh, like I've never thought about that." His tonality was, "I've never had to think about that because I already know the answer." And that's what concerns me, is in hindsight, the nuances of his tone combined with this information that I found out, 8 to 9 months after buying the car really imply that this probably was crashed at some point. So with all these factors combined, I'm pretty convinced at this point that the car was crashed and was repaired. But what does that mean for me? What does that mean for the car? And what does that mean for how I go forward from here? Well, from the perspective of if I can do anything with the previous owner, However, I bought the car as is. It was on me to do the due diligence going into this deal. I gave it a thorough looking over, but I could have gone to more body shops or something to try to look for these things. That said, I'm not convinced anyone would have found it because you couldn't tell the paint was mismatched with how badly the paint was scratched. Even if I had gone to a few shops, like I said, the body panels were in spec and the color was so close that with the paint being in such rough condition, I don't think anyone would have been able to tell, because even my detailer could not tell until the car was paint corrected. And the other part is, like I said, being 8 to 9 months after I purchased the car before I found the damage or really had enough evidence to conclude that it was damaged, that's too far after the purchase to even consider going after them for anything. Most states have laws that really limit you to a 30 to 60 day window. At this point, we're coming up on a year, so no matter what that time limit is, we're past it. Doesn't matter if it's even 6 months, we are past that point. But the other part is, it took me this long to find it because it's very well repaired if it is repaired. Like I said, it took me this long to connect the dots of all these different data points because together they're kind of insignificant. The panel gaps are good. The paint is really close. The suspension in that corner looks fine. I didn't see any frame damage, and I went back and I did check again. So at most, maybe something is slightly tweaked at one of the mounting points that isn't enough for me to see visually, and you'd have to get like a laser scanner to find that. Maybe that's why the car behaves a little bit differently. I really don't know that answer, but like I said, those are very extreme circumstances of loading up that front corner that it does that. And now that I'm aware it does it, I just have to be conscientious of how that corner is going to want to react. So as for how I go forward from this, there's really nothing that I can do or that I really need to do. It's already been repaired. They already did a pretty good job from what I can tell, and the car still does what I like it to do, which is drive well. So the amount of money I would spend trying to diagnose something being off by a couple millimeters and then trying to fix that, or go into a frame shop and seeing if they could try to pull something that I don't even know what's wrong, it could easily turn into a situation where I'm just funneling money into this car to fix something that's not really an issue. So my plan on what I intend to do is I'm going to keep driving it. And if it was damaged, and I am right about that, and the resale value is shot anyway, the miles aren't really going to matter. So I'm going to keep driving this, I'm going to keep putting miles on it, I'm going to keep enjoying it, and then eventually I might repaint it. And that's pretty much it. After I got the paint correction done, I said in a different video that the paint is really fragile now just because of how thin the clear coat is after all the scratches came out. So at some point, I suspect the car might need a respray or a new clear coat at the very least, simply because of how prone it is to scratching at this point. Now, I do my best to avoid that, but if I have the car for, let's say, 5 or 10 years, okay, at that point it might need a refresh. Which means in the meantime, I can just enjoy it, and I can just keep running it hard. I can do the things I like to do with it. I can use it how I want to use it, and I can use it for what I bought it for, which is to have fun. So on one hand, it kind of sucks and reinforces my point that previous owners are always your worst enemy as a car buyer. But on the other hand, they did an okay job repairing it, and I'm still going to enjoy the car. If I find something a little more concrete in the future that proves it was crashed, maybe I'll do a follow-up video and link it below. But to be honest, I don't expect that to happen because I've already done a lot of digging, and this is literally all I could find. So if you're ever buying a Viper, learn from my mistake, take it to a body shop, and explicitly look for damage that's hidden. But either way, that is all I've got for this episode. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.